Love you. Thank you. All right. You were a little off script, but that was good, man. I wrote that for him. He did a good job. Which side do you feel better? The right side? The dominant side? Yeah. All right. So, what does God and a codependent have in common?
Do we need to introduce ourselves first?
I like the joke first. See how she's controlling. I'm going to introduce. Yeah, thank you. Jose, yeah, amen. Thank you.
I need to learn how to read.
It's written here. Our intros come later.
Okay.
Let's pray. No, all right. What does God and a codependent have in common?
They both have a plan for your life.
Hey, all right. Now, yeah. How many of you know that God has a plan for your life? Amen?
How many of you know that the devil also has a plan for your life?
So this is a testimony of two lives, and the two of us would tell you that both the devil and God had big plans for our marriage and family when our paths crossed 21 years ago in a small college in Springfield, Missouri. My name is John. I am a grateful believer in Jesus, and I struggle with codependency.
Hey, guys. John. My name is Jennene. I would rather be on this side, I think. My name is Jennene, and I'm a believer in Jesus, and I struggle with eating disorders and being a know-it-all, as you can plainly see.
Yes, amen.
We were two very different people, perfectly matched to cause maximum chaos in each other's lives. Me with my disordered eating.
And me with my raging codependency. You know, the enemy was rubbing his hands together in glee at the very start on a double date full of nerves and equal parts awkward and binding moments. We fell in love instantly, and the chaos began. But here's something the devil didn't know. God uses chaos too. In fact, that might be the secret why of God's invention of husband and wife. When two people are forced to become one through a marital commitment in the conflict of the conformity, in the breaking and the changing to bend to a bigger vision of what I must do to become we, two individuals crash and smash and tumble and push until they become together what they could have never been apart. The chaos was the only way God could truly create the people that he wanted Jennene and I to be.
Now, when we met in college, to many people, we were an unlikely match. He was a toughened football player with a tumultuous upbringing and a zest for life, and I was a goody two-shoes with a perfectly put-together facade that masked sadness inside. But I knew from the minute I was introduced to John that he was the one for me. We immediately became inseparable. One evening, just before Thanksgiving break, we found ourselves in a used car lot. Well, it was more like a used car graveyard, yes. And I really and truly can't recall why we ended up there. But that night, the snow was falling in white curtains, blanketing the rusty, broken-down shells of the decomposing cars, transforming them. We were so close that I could see the snowflakes on John's lashes. And he kissed me for the first time in that snow-covered garden of broken-down vehicles.
Not long after this hallmark moment, I told her, with heartfelt passion and in a quivering voice, Jennene, I love you. And in response, she said,
I love you as much as I can right now.
Gee, thanks. Not exactly the response I was looking for, but looking back, I would say this exchange actually quite accurately embodied our entire relationship. She truly loved me as much as she could in her pain, in her struggle. She loved me the best as she could, but because of my insecurities and my need to be needed, her efforts to love me were always falling short. The sad fact is, though she wanted to give love, she couldn't receive love because she hated herself. I didn't know that she couldn't receive love honestly because she had become to believe in a great lie.
I believed this lie, that if someone really knew me, they could no longer love me. I'd spent the last 6 years of my life desperately striving to control something that was entirely uncontrollable, to look and act like I was someone worthy of love, someone good enough to be loved. But deep down, I knew that I was not. Because when I was 14 on a summer night, A night that smelled like pine needles and honeysuckle. Everything fell apart, and I was raped. And after, I sobbed into my pillow, and I knew that it had been my fault. I should be ashamed. I had been weak and powerless in a moment when I should have fought back harder, that my body was a pitiful, shameful thing, that men were callous, and that God, He watched the whole thing, and He did nothing. Out of that pain and secret shame, my world broke cleanly into two pieces: life without an eating disorder and life with one. You see, I needed a cure for the secret of my shame, and the eating disorder promised me a remedy, a soft place to land, even if that place was in the pit of hell. I spent the years that followed starving, binging, purging, controlling, manipulating, and feeling ashamed all the while. The harder I tried, the more worthless I felt. And now not only did I need to hide the monstrous truth that I was damaged goods, but I also needed to hide that I was abusing my body through the eating disorder behavior to the point I knew I was going to die. But I just couldn't stop. The eating disorder pulled me further down, whispering lovely promises like, when you're thin, you'll be happy. When you're thin, you'll finally be in control of your body, and when you're thin, you will finally be worthy of love. And I had believed it. I believed every word. But there was John telling me that he loved me. I wanted it to be true, yet I knew it couldn't be. For if he knew me, really knew me, how could he love me? How could anyone?
We both grew up in the Pentecostal church, Assemblies of God to be exact, and we were both heavily involved in our youth groups, went on missions trips, attended conventions, served faithfully in ministry in many ways before we eventually committed to an Assemblies of God college. And you'd think, with that much exposure to and engagement with the bride of Christ, we'd be juggling harps and halos all day long, healing the sick and feeding the poor. But the truth is, sometimes there's as much or more dysfunction inside of the church as there is outside of it. And please understand, the best of who I am is directly as a result of the church. It was in Sunday school where I learned that there was a God in heaven who loved me. And through my parents' divorce, I was reminded that I could put my trust in His Son, Jesus, who would never leave me and He would never forsake me. I had hidden the word in my heart, and I owned His final speech to His disciples as a love letter for me in Matthew 28:20. Surely I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. And as a bullied, chubby, scared kid who felt worthless and alone, church gave me a safe place where I felt valued and I felt loved. It was at church where I felt a sense of belonging. But unfortunately, the church is also where some of my most ugly and egregious character defects were likewise grown and nurtured. And at times, the church, encouraged me to judge, and it bred a holier-than-thou legalism in me. And sometimes it offered a grace that was given on the cross, but then took it away from anyone who refused to live for Him in a way that pleased Him. And somehow the church, and therefore as a result, I sometimes missed the biblical fact that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And much of what I heard in church had me believing that I, and therefore others, had to clean up their act before they deserved the cross. And this was to play out in my adulthood, both with how I felt about myself and how I treated others, especially my wife.
Now, I had a golden childhood. I spent my days riding bikes, exploring fields, cartwheeling, reading Little House on the Prairie. I loved the ocean. I wanted to be a marine biologist when I grew up. I went to church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, every time the doors were open. And it was there in that red-bricked, white steepled church when I was 5 years old, I asked Jesus to come into my heart. I whispered that childlike prayer in a Sunday school classroom in the basement. The floor was covered in that avocado green commercial tile. Fluorescent lights flickered above. It was a place for potlucks, where women's groups gathered weekly, their tables usually spread with pitchers of tea, deviled eggs, and tuna salad sandwiches. Church was a second home. In some ways, it felt more like home than home itself. Church was my childhood, for it was there that I learned what was really true, that God was good and He was just. And if you had faith, you could say to a mountain, move, and it would move. I learned this at church, and I learned it from my mom and dad, who were pillars in that tiny Assemblies of God church in Salisbury, Maryland. My parents possessed a simple faith in God, and I mean that as the highest of compliments. It's the kind of faith that was and is beautiful to behold, the kind of faith that in good times and in bad declares, "It is well with my soul." I revered this kind of faith. It was where I came from. It was who I was. It was who I was going to be. And I never expected that I would be attacked at 14. I never expected to begin to lose my way. I never expected to begin to make choices to cope with life in maladaptive ways, to struggle with a life-threatening eating disorder for 10, 20 years. Church and faith were my birthrights. Why on earth was I such a failure?
You know, we were so anxious to start our life together, we didn't even wait until college was over to get married. We didn't even wait until our first year of marriage was in the books to get pregnant. We didn't wait to settle into parenthood to buy a house. I was in a hurry to be a family, to do this right better than anybody had ever done it before. I was going to be the perfect husband and father. As I've already shared, my parents' marriage ended in divorce, and my siblings and I were split apart. I was set adrift as a preteen to figure out who I was and to puzzle out where I fit in the world. According to my church ethic, I was determined my marriage would be different by sheer moral effort. My kids would never experience the pain and confusion I felt when adults failed me. We would not fail them. Through white-knuckled parenting and the works that were produced through true repentance, we would be the poster family of Christian living. And that was the plan. It was my plan anyway. And out of college, I quickly moved up the ladder in my chosen profession, social work. But then I felt a calling to give my all in answer to the call, selling a brand new house in suburban Northeast to work as an associate pastor in a little church in rural West Virginia. One of my roles as a brand new pastor was to start a ministry called Celebrate Recovery. I had a bout with alcohol in my late teens and early 20s, ultimately dropping out of college in clouds of depression and addiction. I had cried out back then to God, been rescued, so I was aware of the power of admitting powerlessness. But somehow surrender's only value to me as a minister was to recommend it to others. My struggle with alcohol, that was my past. It was my testimony. I was good now. I was a Christian. I had forgotten that God's power is perfected in my ongoing weakness. I couldn't be a mess. My family couldn't be struggling. I was a flippin' pastor, for crying out loud. I was determined to hide my defects so I could lead this recovery ministry effectively. If only my wife could get it together. It seemed impossible for her to play the pastor's wife role to perfection, that I needed her to play it. And when I felt that Jennene was not on board with God's plan for our lives, which actually was my plan for our life, I felt failure's hot breath breathing down my neck, and it was her fault. Her lack of enthusiasm to be my helpmate was not just her failure as an individual, but it was our failure as a Christian family. She was the weak link. I knew the eating disorder was behind it all. Man, but why couldn't she just stop? She didn't have to fail us.
But a failure was what I was. I kept begging and pleading with God to make the eating disorder stop. God can do anything, right? Why wasn't he answering my prayers? I thought I was doing all of the right churchy things, but there I was as a mother of four, a pastor's wife, and I would say, move to the eating disorder, move to shame and regret, but they weren't moving. What was happening? This was not the way my life was supposed to unfold. This was not the kind of life I imagined for myself when the sun was high in the golden sky of my childhood. Not only was that mountain not moving, but church people were beginning to notice. They were beginning to conclude that there was something wrong with the quality of my faith, that there was something wrong with me. I obviously wasn't trying hard enough or believing the right things. Therefore, they needed to remind me of them constantly. You're too thin to sing on stage. You're not supposed to talk about things like this in church. You are a terrible example for our young women. Is that all you're going to eat? Why do you have to be so sad all the time? Your body is a temple. Pray harder. Try harder. Church had always been a safe place. It was a place of refuge until suddenly and slowly it wasn't. It became a place of anguish and pain, and my view of God got mixed up in that whole toxic mess. I knew it shouldn't have been that way, but when hurt was happening at the hands of God's people, it was sometimes an impossible task to extricate God from his church. And then there was John. He was growing angrier by the minute, and not at the church, angry at me. If only you just stop doing what you're doing, we can finally be happy. Don't you want to be happy? He would ask me. Of course, I wanted to be happy. The problem was I didn't even know what happy meant anymore. Happiness Well, it was losing 5 more pounds. Happiness was managing to forget for 1 second that my life was a disappointment. Happiness was having the kind of faith that would actually move a mountain, not the sham faith I seemed to possess. Happiness was John and I being united together in life and in ministry. But none of that was happening, and it seemed it never would. I had always believed in some form or fashion that we were in ministry together. Sure, I never went to CR. Are you kidding me? Admit that I had a problem? And yes, I was withdrawing day by day from church activities, but all of that was justified behavior. I always believed John was on my side, that we were allied together, but for some unexplainable reason, he always seemed to be defending the church. I couldn't understand it. I knew that he was on the receiving end of some very, very hurtful interactions with church people himself. They would tell him things like, please do something about your wife. If you really knew how to help people, your wife would not be struggling like she is. Why he kept taking the church's side was a baffling and very hurtful mystery to me. John soon became the agent, the representation of all the misguided things I believed about the church, that love had conditions and strings. Yes, there were always strings attached. When I finally reached a place that I knew the eating disorder was going to kill me, John had enough. Go into treatment or we are through. It was an ultimatum issued out of tough love. Deep down, I know it really was, but all I saw at that time was the tough part. And of course, there were strings attached. John and the church orchestrated a plan for me to go into inpatient treatment, which we certainly could not afford. The church agreed to help cover some of the expenses. That's unbelievably generous, right? And it was. I'm deeply thankful because there's no way I would have been able to go otherwise. But generosity had strings attached. And these strings demanded that I publicly share with the church what was really going on with me. So on a Sunday morning, on the day before I left to go into treatment, I stood on the stage of the church dressed in my Sunday best. I clutched a microphone in my hand, and I shared my long history with failure. I shared about my pain, how I was going to be leaving my kids behind, my life behind. I was pitiful. I was exposed before God and man, and now everybody knew that I was a failure. I'd done everything in my power throughout the last 20 years of my life to conceal the fact that I had problems and that I would just never measure up. But I was convinced in that moment, standing on that stage, that showing people, church people no less, who I really was, it was going to be the death of me. There would be no coming back from that kind of spectacular ruin. Now, I know that the enemy intended that Sunday morning confessional for evil, but God had other plans. Because as I shared that morning, and I was shrinking down in vulnerability and in shame, I experienced a moment of clarity because I saw Jesus. He was hanging on a cross, and he was exposed before God and man. And never before had I realized that Jesus made himself vulnerable when he hung naked and dying on the cross for my secrets and my shame. Vulnerability wasn't a path to ruin. It was the way of the cross. And resurrection was waiting on the other side.
Finally, she was going to get the professional help that she needed. It wasn't ideal, but we were going to be exposed as being a hot mess of a family. Then sending Jennene away it made a clear distinction that she was the problem, not me. She was going to go away for 45 days at the best inpatient eating disorder clinic in the world. And I had done the research, had the conversations with intake managers, made the arrangements with the financial team at Remuda in Wickenburg, Arizona, and I had coordinated with her parents to come and help out with the girls. We told our 4 daughters that Mommy was going away for a while to learn how to be happy. I told the pastors I worked for in the church board that she's got to go so we can save her. As we neared the final days before our parting, she got in front of the congregation and publicly took a beating. While I went behind closed doors and privately accepted condolences for having to deal with such a chaotic marriage. Poor John. Man, you've done all that you could do. We'll be praying for you to be strong and that she'll come to her senses and realize what she's got. She needs to realize she's throwing away a great life. Doesn't she know how this is affecting you and the kids? I ate it up. She was the problem. I was the victim. Everyone was finally seeing things for how they really were. I had held this family together all these years, despite living with the chaos of a woman hell-bent on self-destruction. I hadn't failed. She had. I should have felt more in control than ever when she went into treatment. So why did I feel so powerless?
I went to treatment, and I fought and I clawed my way through day after day of feeling like I was living in a nightmare. I fought against anything and everything associated with being in treatment. I even ran away into the desert on Thanksgiving Day. They hunted me down, though, just like Harrison Ford in the movie The Fugitive. I will admit quite candidly that I had a horrible attitude while I was in treatment. Truly, truly awful. But I stayed the whole time. Yes, I did. That's something, right? It was something I could finally be proud of. I returned home from treatment with a new hope in my heart. Maybe I could finally conquer this eating disorder once and for all. But life was hard, and now I had to manage it without the eating disorder. And not only that, everybody, and I mean everybody, now knew what I struggled with. Constant fluctuations in my weight were a matter of public discourse. People tracked my health and appearance with as much earnestness and zeal as their fantasy football players. They were only too eager to tell me all about their observations. Shame was slowly settling back on me again. The old desires to be thin were creeping back in. It was doubly discouraging because I thought I conquered it. Relapse followed relapse. And I soon became what I'd always feared I would be, a public spectacle and an unmitigated failure.
Her returning from Bermuda should have felt like a victory, but it felt like nothing was working as I had planned. The emotional and spiritual ground beneath me felt like quicksand. All I saw in front of me was an unpredictable, unrecognizable future. She was home, but she looked and she acted in many ways like the same old Jennene I sent away for wholesale transformation. I tried to tighten things down through control and manipulation. It was a common tactic of mine. Subtle guilt trips when she would struggle. Is that what you learned at Bermuda? Really? Passive-aggressive days of the silent treatment to punish her for transgressing. We codependents are brutal in our own way. We weaponize shame to steer our victims the way we think they should go. Everything in recovery that I had learned to that point told me I had to surrender my wife to God and live in faith that God had her. He had us. How many times had I taught that to other people? In counseling sessions, in large group teachings, I challenged others, let go and let God in your marriage. And now here I was wrestling with the same truth, trying to wrestle her away from God, who was the real Savior of her life. Isaiah 23:11 says, I am the Lord. There is no Savior but me. And principle 1 says, realize I am not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing and that my life is unmanageable.
The next summer, after I returned home from treatment, I was as bad as I'd ever been. And despite my discouragement for some crazy reason, when John tentatively asked me if I wanted to attend the Celebrate Recovery Summit at Saddleback Church, I agreed to go. As I sat at the summit, I listened to a testimony, just like you are right now. And it was a mother, and she was around my age. And when she finished sharing, she invited her teenage daughter up to share. And when she finished sharing, she invited her little sister up to share. And when she finished sharing, she invited her grandmother up to share. And when she finished, she invited her mother, the great-grandmother, up who shared. And when they finished, they stood on that stage, shoulder to shoulder, generation after generation of proof that change is possible. And they were smiling, the unbridled smile of redemption. I began to sob. I had never wanted anything so bad in my life as I wanted what I saw, what they had. When I was looking at them, it was the deepest, most desperate desire of my heart. I promised myself that I would do anything to get it. So I returned home from the summit, and I went to Celebrate Recovery. And I meant business. I attended meetings every single time the doors were open. I didn't care who was there or what they knew about me. I just kept coming back. I joined a step study. I actually joined 6 step studies at this point. I worked the life-giving 12 steps. I got a sponsor, and I used her all the time. Freedom was going to be mine. Those women on the stage at the Celebrate Recovery Summit were my North Star, and I was determined to have what they had.
Finally, everything was clicking. Jennene and I were doing ministry together. CR was growing. I was on the national team for Celebrate Recovery, and my kids were, for the most part, just thriving. But a few days after Christmas 2012, the youth pastor, our senior pastor, and myself in that church in West Virginia were called to an elders meeting after church one Sunday morning. They wanted to speak to us individually about what none of us knew. Our senior pastor was called in first. 30 minutes later, the youth pastor went in. After 90 minutes of waiting, I finally heard, "Come on back, John." And it was in the prayer room that they had their meeting. They had one thing to tell me, and that's that I no longer had a job. They were letting me and the senior pastor go, and they wanted to move in a new direction. I just kind of listened and nodded, and I heard myself say, "I understand." They asked, could they pray for me? I listened to myself say, "Sure you can." They laid hands on me, and I felt my stomach revolt. What would happen if I just started throwing up while they prayed for me? Would they just keep praying and laying their hands on me while I vomited all over their prayer room carpet, and their suits and their ties and their shiny church dress shoes? I went home, and I told my wife and kids I'd been fired. "What are we going to do?" Jennene asked. "I don't know." Lily, just 11 years old at the time, burst into tears, grabbed me around the neck, and she screamed out, "But you're the best pastor in the whole world." It was the sweetest thing she could have possibly told me, but I was done being a pastor. Now I was the failure. Everything was stripped away from me. I had done everything I felt God had told me to do. I'd given up so much to come to this God-forsaken town in West Virginia. For what? I told God I had tried it His way. Now I'm going to go take care of me and my family like I always should have done in the first place. I felt like a failure. I was miserable, and I felt very, very alone.
I was in a new world of hurt I didn't know was even possible. I thought I'd already experienced the worst that a church could dish out, but this wasn't just a person who hurt me. It was an entire institution. And my kids. What on earth was I supposed to tell my kids? Everything they'd ever known, everything that had formed the fabric of their own church experience was suddenly and unceremoniously gone. Why don't we go to church there anymore? Why did they fire Daddy? Did he do something wrong? Who? What? Where? Why? The questions were endless. What was I supposed to tell them? That we weren't welcome there anymore? That they threw us away like a piece of garbage? That things could never, ever go back to the way they were? Was I supposed to tell them what I really felt? That I was just as lost as they were?
A few weeks later, I had to go to the National Celebrate Recovery planning meeting that convened across the country every year in January. But man, I was still reeking of anger and pain as I got on that flight to California. I felt like the church had just divorced me. They left me for somebody else. Man, I loved CR. But man, church was church, and I was just tired of all of it. I was done with the ministry, done with the assemblies of God. Man, I hated the assemblies of God because I had given so much, and they just took it all away from me. I was just determined when I got on that airplane not to talk to a living soul the entirety of the flight there and back. People like to be chatty on airplanes, and sometimes I'll chat with them, but I put on my hat, I put my headphones on, I grabbed my book and buried my face in it. But before I could settle in, a tiny white-haired lady sat down next to me, smiled at me, and said, "Hey, how you doing?" I'm fine. Next question. "Hey, what do you do for a living?" Man, I could have said anything. Social worker, counselor, Alaskan crab fisherman. I could have said anything. But instead, I blurted out the last thing I wanted to say. I said, "I'm a pastor." She lit up like a Christmas tree, turned around in her seat, shouted back to some guy 3 rows back and says, "Hey, Charity, he's a pastor." She looks at me, she says, "We're Assemblies of God missionaries." Dear God, why have you forsaken me? How's the ministry going? She asked me. I felt my mouth kind of moving. I was trying to formulate an answer when some dam inside of me just burst. I started just sobbing on that airplane, just sobbing. Uncontrollable, undeniable pain. It was like a vessel broken, poured out on an airplane. Sitting on the tarmac in Pittsburgh, this precious woman didn't blink an eye. She placed her hand on my lap. I hadn't said a word about what happened. And she began to tell me a story. She said, "You know, when Charity and I started ministry, everything was great. Our family was together. Charity had just got his ordination." She said, "We're driving to the ordination service." She said, "We never really had seat belts that we used back then. We were driving on the way to the church. My 3-year-old was bouncing around in the back seat." She said the 3-year-old grabbed the door handle. The door opened up and she fell out the back door. She said she turned around to watch it happen and the car behind him ran her daughter over. I'm like, this is not helping, lady. She said at the hospital, she said my husband just laid underneath that hospital bed praying for their 3-year-old, just praying for her. God, save her. So much faith. He was a pastor. He was ordained. He was praying, and she died. She said, my husband went to the door, turned the door handle of the hospital, and he heard God say, "If you trust me, I will let you share my gospel all over this world." She said he never left the room. She said, but that wasn't my story. She said, this is what I heard. She didn't tell me what she heard. She began to sing to me on that airplane. Right on that airplane. An old Andre Crouch song called "Through It All." I've had many tears and sorrow. I've had questions for tomorrow. There have been times I didn't know right from wrong. But in every situation, God gave me blessed consultation. That my trials come to only make me strong. Through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. I've learned to trust in God. You know, God's worked so many miracles in my life before, but I'm saying nothing is ever compared to that plane ride. There's no other human being on earth that could have reached through the massive wall of my anger and pain that was built, except for this tiny, disarming Assemblies of God missionary. Sometimes I wonder if it was a dream, if she was some kind of an angel. But she sent me her husband's book called "Only a Little Boy." And I keep it on my bookshelf in my office today to remind me I'm powerless. But God, His power can restore me to sanity. He loves me. And it's good that He's in control.
So really, in a matter of weeks, in a miraculous turn of events, just weeks after his firing, John was hired at a larger church in a town right next to us called Horizons Church. I was overjoyed that John had the promise of a steady income and that we'd be able to start to celebrate recovery together. The fact that it was a church was problematic, to say the least, to me, because I was eaten up with cynicism. I would never allow myself to be wounded by a church again. Never. I showed up and I smiled and I performed. I was bracing myself for the barrage of attention that I was going to be receiving once people found out I'd recently been in treatment for an eating disorder. But wait, what was happening? No one expected this pastor's wife to be perfect. They seemed to be able to grasp that I was an individual, not just an extension of my husband. There weren't a special set of rules for me as a pastor's wife. I could even wear my beloved stretchy pants, aka leggings, to church, and nobody cared at all. They were fine with me just showing up at Celebrate Recovery and doing my thing. It was just what I needed. Just what I needed. It was the perfect environment for my healing to begin. And here's the beautiful catch. It was at a church. Now, all this sounds like a happy ending, and it certainly was the beginning of one. But I still had years of pain to work through, and I had major trust issues with God and with His people. The only place I felt safe was at Celebrate Recovery, so I threw myself into my eating disorder recovery with everything I had. That's why I was going to Celebrate Recovery after all. But if the Son sets you free, then you will be free. John 8:36. So you see, redemption has a way of showing up not only in the places we expect it and are looking for it, but in the deepest parts of who we are, in the darkest corners of our hurt. Redemption showed up for me for my eating disorder, and then it showed up for me for my church hurt. Because I began to see through Celebrate Recovery that people are just people, even the ones that bear the name Christian, that they're just trying to do what I was trying to do, which is cope with life, cope with their own hurt. Sure, they hurt me. They were a very poor representation of the light of the world. But what does that have to do with who God really is? God is love, both for prodigals and for the hard done by obedient sons. 2 years ago, I decided when we were living here, so 2 years ago, I drove back to West Virginia with the express intention I was going to make amends with that church that hurt me. I didn't know what I would do or what making an amends would even look like. It was fall, and the trees were heavy with fiery golden leaves. I took a walk along a river that was near the church, and I prayed that God would give me the strength to offer forgiveness, true forgiveness. I got in my car, and I drove by the church. I did a drive-by amend that day because that was all I had the strength to do. I said, I forgive you, as I drove by. And my eyes were blurring with tears. Years of memories of hurt, disappointment spilled down my cheeks. I forgive you. I forgive you.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to move my family to this strange Baptist church in North Carolina. And I will forever be grateful for Horizons Church, the way they welcomed us, and it was just this perfect landing, a place to heal. The way they sent us off with prayer and love and in friendship. We've been here at Temple for 3 years. I've never loved a church. Thank you. What a gift. There was healing at Horizons, but it feels like this is a new birth. I feel like I'm born again. And while I do run this particular program, I'm still working the program. I'm still a work in progress. We kind of went back and forth on this, but a couple of days ago, we just sat down and we were at Starbucks. And I said, as we were reading this over, I said, Jennene, would it be good to say maybe that because of everything that I did, and this is like an inventory for me, I didn't realize how bad I had hurt her. I said, would you say that you felt like the black sheep of our family? And she looked at me and she said, I still feel that way. And she said, while you were in the hospital in California, and we were praying, we thought, just that little bit of time you guys heard about it, that I thought I wasn't sure what was going to happen. While I was praying, I was going, God, save me. I want to be here for my kids. I want more years. She honestly looked at me and she said, I was praying. She was praying, God, take her. Because she thinks now that the kids would be better off with me as their only parent than her. I've been doing this for a lot of years, man. And that my wife still feels that way. I just want you to know I'm still a work in progress. And I want to publicly say, I'm so sorry. I have a lot of work to do. But you know, if you've ever caught sight of a majestic mountain peak, understand that it took two tectonic plates stubbornly, just violently colliding to force this heavenward compromise. And I still think Satan is using chaos to try to destroy our families and our lives. But here's a secret. God uses chaos too.
Yep. Rick Warren once said that your greatest ministry will most likely come out of your greatest hurt. And that sure is true for us. If you are a newcomer, please take it from us. God doesn't want you to just merely get over your hurt, your habit, or your hang-up. He wants to redeem it. And he will, if you surrender it to him. Thank you for letting us share.
Guys. Thank you. Now, amen. Thank you. If you'd stay standing. Chelsea, you could start playing that music. Listen, there's two things I want to express to you. The more we do ministry, and Rodney and I have had this conversation, the more we do ministry, the more we know that there are some people out there who are dealing with church hurt. You have all kinds of hurt. People have hurt you. You've been abused. You've been taken advantage of. But some of you are specifically tonight, you're dealing with hurt that you've had at the hands of religious folks. And I want to give this opportunity tonight for you to begin to work on that. And work on anything else that you feel like you need to surrender to God. Maybe it's a struggle with an eating disorder. Maybe it's a struggle with pride. Maybe it's the way you treat your spouse. Tonight is chip night. We have blue chips up on the altar. These are surrender chips. And these aren't little magic medallions that'll make you behave better. But it's an outward sign of something that's happening inside of you. If you've relapsed, God says, all you got to do is look to Him. Ask forgiveness. He said He will purify you from all unrighteousness. If you're struggling, He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. If you're struggling at the hands of an abuser, and maybe that abuser was the church, and you want to find freedom, I want you to start your journey. If there's something in your life you want to surrender tonight, maybe you've relapsed with drugs, alcohol, I don't care. We're just glad you came back. Maybe you want to bring your spouse up here and apologize and take a blue chip and say, man, I want to start over. I'm so sorry. Maybe there's somebody you've hurt here and you want to grab and say, I want to apologize to you. I want to start over. I want a different kind of a life. I want to treat people differently. I don't know what it is, but would everybody just close your eyes and bow your heads? Father, I just pray that you would give each one of us just a new place of surrender, of letting go, a new place to say, God, use me, empty me of myself. I am hurting, I'm struggling, I've kept it quiet. There's something keeping me from you, and I want to surrender it. You're ready to take a blue chip tonight. As you close your eyes, God's speaking to you, and He wants you to come up here, take a blue chip, get on your knees, and give it to Him. So on the count of 3, I want you to start moving up to this altar and take a blue chip. 1, 2, 3. Just come right now. Come. It's you. God's speaking to you. Take a blue chip. Spend some time at this altar. Jeannie and I want to pray over you and pray for you and pray with you as you surrender a parent to Him, as you surrender a child to Him, as you surrender an addiction to Him, as you surrender a relationship to Him, as you surrender a hurt to Him, as you surrender a church that has hurt you to Him, as you surrender your bitterness and your cynicism and your anger to Him, as you say, God, take my worry and my fear, take it, God, change me, God, move me, Lord, into a place of surrender. Just come. Maybe you're a minister, maybe you're brand new, it doesn't matter. God's gonna seek those that are lost. He says, I'm coming after that one more, that one more. Just come and spend some time here and say, God, I need to surrender this to you tonight. Don't leave this altar till you've surrendered it to Him. God, we surrender it. Just say it right now. God, I give it to you right now. Just say it out loud. I give it to you, Lord. Hold that chip up. Say, it's yours, Lord. Take it from me. Take it from me, Lord. I can't do it on my own. If you know how to pray, I want you to come and pray over those who've surrendered. These blue chips are significant. I don't want them to be up here alone. You don't have to be a leader. You just have to know how to pray. Come, and if you're a guy, pray with a guy. Ladies, pray with ladies. I want you to come and just pray over these people who have courageously taken a step forward and said, I surrender. Come on, I need some people to pray over these folks. Come and just pray right now. God, move in their lives. Help them to know that there is somebody who is here for them, that they're not alone. Don't stand there if you're a Christian and you know how to pray. I want you to come and pray over those who are at this altar. I need for them to feel a touch of their shoulder to say, I'm with you. I'm here with you. We can do this together. You don't have to be alone. You don't have to do this by yourself. Your surrender is something that we're going to honor. We're going to get into this garbage and this mess together. Come on, just come and pray over somebody and tell them that you love them.